Imagine 3 days trapped in the mountains, snow erasing every trail you knew, no GPS, no brick wall between you and the wind, no jacket built in a lab to save you. That was just a normal winter, neighbor, for the Apache families living in the mountains of New Mexico. And they didn't just survive it. Half the decisions that kept them alive that winter had already been made months before the first snowflake ever touched the ground. Come sit with me a while because I want to take that system apart for you, piece by piece. Before I go any further, I need to say something plain, the way I always do when a story takes me off my own people's ground. The Apache was never one people, neighbor, no matter how the old Western movies told it. In New Mexico alone, you had different groups living different lives on different mountains. The Mescalero moved through the south, the Sierra Blanca, the Sacramento Range, the Guadalupe Mountains. The Jicarilla held the north, up in the Sangre de Cristo Range, around the Chama, the Canadian, the Pecos rivers. Each group built their answer to winter out of what their own ground gave them. And I'm going to keep that difference honest all the way through this one. My name is Running Bear Walker, 54 years old, Eastern Band Cherokee. Raised in the Smoky Mountains on the ridge, my grandfather, Thomas Walker, never once agreed to leave. This isn't my people's mountains, neighbor. I'm not Mescalero, and I'm not Jicarilla. What I'm handing you tonight, I pieced together the honest way. My grandfather's journal, elders willing to sit with a Cherokee man about ground that wasn't his, and whatever record still holds up once you check it close. Stay with me. This one's got more discipline packed into it than almost anything I've brought you. Here's the first thing that surprised me when I really sat with this neighbor. The fight against winter didn't start with the first snowfall. It started months earlier with a people who never stopped moving. Mescalero families spent their year working the Sacramento, Guadalupe, and Sierra Blanca ranges, hunting deer and bighorn sheep, gathering agave, peñon, acorn, and yucca fruit as each came into season. When the cold started closing in, families gathered in the Guadalupe Mountains, their traditional winter ground. You can still find hundreds of old agave roasting pits scattered through that country today, neighbor. The same spots, used the same way, for longer than anybody's kept count. The Jicarilla worked harder ground, up higher, and pulled back toward the mountains between the Canadian River and the Rio Grande, trading and living alongside the Picuris, Taos, and Pecos Pueblo peoples. Out of that mixing, plains hunters meeting Pueblo farmers, grew a different kind of knowledge, part movement, part storage, built from both traditions at once. By the time any storm actually arrived, every family already knew the answer to 4 questions. Where the dry wood was, which ground broke the wind, where water still ran once the creeks locked up with ice, and which paths would still carry a person through once the snow came down. There was no forecast, neighbor. There was watching, wind, animal movement, the plants themselves, done every single day until it stopped being a skill and just became how a person lived. Once the ground was chosen, the shelter came next. The wickiup was the everyday answer, a low dome built from bent willow, oak, or cottonwood branches, staked into the earth and covered with dry grass, bark, or brush, reinforced come winter with deer or elk hide. Its strength wasn't size, and it wasn't how solid it stood. It was speed. A family could raise a wickiup in a few hours and tear it back down just as fast, which mattered a great deal to a people who moved with the seasons instead of fighting to stay in one place past its season. When buffalo hide was available through hunting or trade, some families used hide tents instead. I want to be honest with you here, neighbor, the same way the people who study this stay honest about it. A wickiup wasn't airtight, and it wasn't warm on its own. Nobody lit a fire inside one. The space was too small, the materials too quick to catch. Its whole job was cutting the wind. The warmth came from the bodies inside it and the hides they wrapped themselves in through the night. It was one piece of a bigger system, neighbor, not a solution standing on its own. It only worked stacked together with the right ground and the right clothing. Up north, among the Jicarilla, the old stone rings that mark where lodges once stood point to more frequent use of the teepee, especially once the horse arrived and made it possible to haul longer poles across that harder country. The choice between a wickiup and a teepee was never about looks, neighbor. It answered to climate, to what materials were close at hand, and to how often a family needed to move. If the shelter's whole job was breaking the wind, the fire was what carried the rest of daily life straight through winter. It cooked the stored meat and plant food. It dried clothing soaked through by snow or sweat. It lit the long nights and let the work keep going. Tools, moccasins, weapons, even with snow falling outside. And the fire was where the teaching happened too, neighbor. Stories told there, skills passed down there. The next move the group would make, planned out sitting right there in that light. Since no fire ever burned inside the wickiup itself, most of winter life happened around outdoor fires, sheltered by wherever the camp had been placed to begin with. Only at night did a family pull back into the shelter, wrapped in hide, living off warmth already stored up in the body. I don't have solid enough detail on the exact fire-starting methods used by these particular groups to hand you something specific, neighbor, and I'm not going to invent one just to fill the silence. What I can tell you is this: dry wood was one of the things that decided where winter camp got placed at all, whether that meant the forests around Guadalupe and Sacramento, or the Ponderosa pine slopes across Jicarilla country. By day, the work never stopped. Hunting, gathering wood, keeping the camp running. And that meant clothing had a different job than the shelter did. It had to protect a body without slowing it down. The base was buckskin, tanned deer hide. Men traded the summer breechcloth for a long shirt and leggings that guarded the legs against wind and brush. Women wore two-piece buckskin dresses, adding extra robes on the hardest days. The piece most people picture first is the tall moccasin, sewn from a single piece of hide over a thicker sole, rising to the knee, sometimes folded in layers around the calf. That wasn't decoration, neighbor. It let a person cover real distance over rough, uneven ground, guarded against both cold and thorny brush, and could be adjusted depending on the day's work. The upturned toe you see in pictures, that part really does look like it was mostly about how it looked, not what it did. The whole logic underneath all of it was balance. Too much clothing could turn dangerous just as fast as too little, because it slowed a person down on ground where a bad step could cost a fall or a real injury. So clothing came in layers, added or stripped depending on the task at hand, especially once the horse arrived and riding demanded a different kind of freedom to move. Now winter didn't just threaten the body, neighbor, it cut off access to most of what fed a person the rest of the year. So the warm months went almost entirely toward building up what would carry a family through the cold ones. For the mescalero, the center of that whole effort was the very thing that gave them their name, the heart of the agave plant, cooked for days in earth ovens until it turned into a sweet pulp, then dried and pressed into cakes that could last for months. Alongside that came dried deer, elk, and bison meat, and piñón gathered each fall, the amount stored depending entirely on how good that year's harvest had been. Acorn, mesquite, and yucca fruit rounded out what they could put away. The jicarilla combined bison hunting out on the eastern plains with gathering seeds, acorn, and yucca, and added something the mescalero didn't have as much of: corn, squash, and beans, farming knowledge picked up in part from their Pueblo neighbors. That mix gave them a broader food base heading into winter. In both cases, meat got dried and packed away in rawhide bags. Once a storm hit, neighbor, there was no going out to look for more. You lived on what was already put up, and that fact alone shaped where winter camp got placed in the first place. A storm didn't just drop the temperature, it remade the whole landscape. Snow buried familiar trails, hid the rocks and roots underneath, and swallowed sound, making it harder to find your way and harder to hear trouble coming. The wind piled that snow unevenly too, leaving some ground nearly bare right next to drifts deep enough to swallow a person whole. I don't have solid evidence on the specific techniques these groups used for moving through deep snow, neighbor, so I'm not going to hand you something I made up and dress it as fact. What I can tell you with confidence is this: the knowledge of family had already built up about that ground, the roots, the slopes, the landmarks, learned across the rest of the year, became the single most valuable tool once a storm actually hit. The horse, adopted after contact with the Spanish, widened how far a family could move, but it brought its own limit right along with it. A horse suffers in deep snow and ice same as anybody, and caring for it became one more responsibility riding on a family's shoulders in the worst weather. Maybe the hardest decision wasn't how to move at all, neighbor. It was knowing when to stay put. Setting out on a trip that didn't need taking right in the middle of a storm could cost a family far more than just waiting out an uncomfortable but familiar shelter ever would. What might look like doing nothing from the outside was really the sharpest kind of judgment a person could carry. That same judgment showed up in hunting too, and this is a part of the story that doesn't get told nearly enough. Fresh snow made animal tracks easier to read, sure, but that same snow made the whole landscape more dangerous to move through. Less visibility, more energy burned with every step, and a fall or a wrong turn out there could cost far more than whatever animal a hunter was chasing. A good hunter wasn't measured only by his aim or his tracking, neighbor. He was measured by whether he could honestly weigh the real risk of going out that day at all. More often than you'd think, the right call was staying close to camp, drawing on what was already stored and waiting it out. That wasn't a lack of courage. That was the exact same practical intelligence that decided where to camp and which path to take, just turned toward a different question. None of this the ground, the shelter, the fire, the clothing, the food, the movement, the judgment about when to hunt at all, ever came from a manual, neighbor. It passed down through watching. Children saw a wickiup go up, saw mescal cooked down, saw hide tanned and moccasins stitched, saw how a person read what the land itself was trying to tell them. From what the record shows, women traditionally built and kept up the dwellings and handled most of the plant food, while men carried the weight of the hunting. That division got learned by doing, not by memorizing, and the stories told around the fire kept reinforcing it, generation after generation. I don't want to leave you thinking this was some flawless routine, neighbor, because it wasn't. A fire could go out if the wind ran too strong or nobody tended it in time. Clothing could soak through crossing a half-frozen creek, and wet hide loses most of what it's worth for keeping a body warm. Stores could run dry before winter let go, especially after a poor piñon harvest the year before, and a person could get separated from the group in the middle of snow and wind, same as anybody could. Soldiers, traders, and missionaries who had contact with these groups between the 1600s and the 1800s left accounts describing just how hard those winters could be. Though I'd read those with some caution, neighbor, since they were written by outsiders, often in the middle of conflict with all the bias that carries. This whole system didn't stay whole forever either. As the Spanish, then the Mexicans, then the Americans moved in, the open country these families had used freely for generations started breaking apart. New trade routes, new settlements, livestock, and eventually guns, all of it throwing off the balance between movement, hunting, and what the land could still provide. The hardest blow landed on the Mescalero in 1863. General James Carleton led a military campaign that forced close to 500 Mescalero men, women, and children off their own ground and marched them alongside thousands of Navajo people to an internment camp called Bosque Redondo near Fort Sumner. The conditions there were brutal: neighbor, hunger, disease, and a landscape nothing like the one their entire system of survival had been built around for generations. Within a couple of years, a large part of that population escaped by night and made their own way back to the mountains on foot without help from anybody. In 1873, the Mescalero Reservation was formally established in the Sacramento Mountains, smaller than the land they'd known, but still connected to the same country that had sustained their whole way of life. The Jicarilla lived through a different road to the same kind of hardship: forced relocations, broken treaties, years of being pushed from place to place until a reservation was finally established in northern New Mexico in 1887. With all of that, seasonal movement got squeezed down to the edges of reservation land. Access to traditional hunting and gathering ground was lost. Trade goods, wool blankets among them, started replacing pieces of the old equipment. But the knowledge underneath all of it, neighbor, the real understanding of that territory, those plants, those animals, that climate, never disappeared. It adapted, and it's still a living part of Mescalero and Jicarilla communities today. Let's go back to that first night I asked you to picture, neighbor, a family inside the wickiup, snow piling up outside, wind working against the mountainside. Now you know that scene never rested on one clever object or one lucky trick. It rested on a whole system, built months ahead of the first snowfall. The right ground chosen early, a shelter light enough to move, but built to do its one job well, fire managed with care, clothing made to protect without ever slowing a person down, food put up in time, movement handled with real judgment, and the discipline to know when not to hunt at all. None of that was magic, neighbor, and it wasn't some kind of advanced technology, by the way we'd use that word today. It was knowledge built up over centuries, shaped until it fit that exact ground and that exact climate. And that kind of fit is still one of the most sophisticated things a people can carry. Tell me something before you go, neighbor. Which piece of that system would have been hardest for you to figure out on your own? The shelter, the food, or just the cold itself? Put it in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. That's the story I go deeper on next. Hit subscribe if you're new here. Not for me, for the knowledge we keep pulling back into the light on this channel. You're going to want to be here for the next one.